85% of New York's emissions, and just, how you can participate in submitting public comments. So the scoping plan is a massive document. It's 330 pages with another 500 plus appendices. Unfortunately, there's no cliff notes on this thing. And so it's hard for people to get through. But I just wanted to give you a sense. This is basically, you can see that it's very comprehensive in what it covers, not only the sectors that are responsible for emissions, but also cross-cutting issues like land use policies, the role of local governments, economy-wide strategies like carbon pricing and the like. What is the draft scoping plan? So just, this is basically the implementation plan to reach the goals of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And I think you all are familiar with it, but just as a quick review, the main overarching goals are reducing, and these are statutory targets in law that we are bound by law to meet, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 below 1990 levels. So just 8 years from now, that's a pretty significant reduction. And achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It's an 85% reduction in emissions, and the other 15% has to be sequestered, in our natural and working lands. And if we have time, we can talk a little bit about that. We are also required to be generating 70% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030 and achieving an entirely fossil-free grid by 2040. And really critically importantly, our transition to a clean energy economy has to be just and equitable. Our law requires that we prioritize disadvantaged communities and that we as a state, the state dedicates 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. So the scoping plan is extremely important because it will shape state legislation, regulation, and the decision-making of every state agency and department for years to come. The plan is, the law created this. It didn't spell out how we were to get there. It called for the creation of this plan, to spell it out, and that plan has to be updated every 5 years. The plan was developed by a 22-member Climate Action Council established under the climate law. That council includes all of the heads of the relevant state agencies and departments, as well as 10 appointed members that include a mix of environmental and climate justice advocates, industry representatives, and scientists. The council's work was informed by the recommendations of 7 advisory panels that each had expertise in different areas that directly related to our emissions, as well as a climate justice working group and just transition working group, which were also both created under the climate law. I wanted to mention too that the climate justice working group is also charged with defining the criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities. And this is a parallel process to the scoping plan. And they have actually the Climate Justice Working Group has developed 45 criteria, and those criteria are now open for public comment in a separate process. And if you have questions about it, I can answer that. I try to answer them, but there's also separate public hearings on the draft criteria and map as well. This is a map when that criteria is applied to New York State. So this is taken from the scoping plan, this pie chart, and it's based on the most up-to-date greenhouse gas emissions inventory for New York. As you can see, buildings are responsible for the largest share of emissions, with transportation a close second. Together, they account for 60% of our emissions. Electricity accounts for 13%, but has an outsized importance because it is the linchpin of the clean energy transition, which is about electrifying everything. And I just want to mention that the law required some changes to the way we do our inventory in New York. You have to consider, the inventory considers, not just, well, for instance, when you turn on your gas stove, it's not just considering those emissions, it's all of the upstream emissions too, including from, the production of that frack gas in other states. So it's far more comprehensive than most states. And it also uses a 20-year GW time frame rather than a 100 GWP. So meeting our goals is going to require transformational changes in every sector. This is a snapshot of the kind of changes that have to be made according to an integration analysis that was done for the scoping plan. The integration analysis did modeling to try to see what would be necessary to get to our goals, but essentially common across the models was, to reach those greenhouse gas reductions of 40% by 2030, we really need to electrify about 1 to 2 million homes with heat pumps by 2030, replace 3 million gas vehicles on the road with zero emissions vehicles. Those will be EVs primarily. I think we have about somewhere around 50,000 on the road today, so that's a huge change that's going to have to occur. We're going to have to be diverting 100% of our organic waste from landfills. So these are really big changes. And by 2040, fossil fuel power plants, which account statewide for 43% of our generation, have to be fully retired, replaced primarily by wind and solar, together with battery storage. Other resources as well, but those are likely going to be the biggest. So the analysis for the integration analysis for the scoping plan found that the cost of inaction would be far higher than the cost of policies to meet our climate goals, on the order of about $90 billion by 2050. And that is when you take into account avoided health costs from fossil fuel pollution, as well as the avoided damages from climate change. I mean, obviously, it's going to take more than New York to avoid those damages, but those costs can't be ignored in the model. So the health benefits for New Yorkers alone would be tremendous because of the other pollutants from fossil fuels that we'll be eliminating that are debilitating to people's health, particularly in disadvantaged communities where polluting infrastructure is typically located. The integration analysis estimates that, we'll save on the order of $50 to $120 billion from health improvements alone. So the jobs that would be created in New York for the clean energy transition are really unprecedented. And I think this is something that's really important to emphasize, especially given the pushback from the trade unions, and we can talk about that. But, the Just Transition Working Group, which I mentioned, was required to do a job study, which it published and which is available on the Climate Action Council's website, along with the scoping plan. But the job study estimates that we'll see statewide a net gain of almost 190,000 jobs by 2030 if we stay on target to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals, reaching 268,000 jobs by 2050. The largest wage increase is in the middle wage positions, which is, of course, bucking the trend of the last 50 years of a declining middle class. And over half of those new jobs are in the building sector because, these are labor-intensive industries. And as we'll discuss in a moment, we have over 6 million buildings in New York, and we're going to, have to be making improvements to all of our buildings. The ratio of jobs gained to jobs displaced is estimated to be will be about 10 to 1, which is of course huge, but it's the impacts on displaced workers, cannot be ignored. And, it's incredibly important that New York start doing the work now, to, prepare to start doing the job training and preparation that's needed to shift workers in affected industries, fossil fuel industries primarily, to clean energy occupations. And that's something that I really hope that people will amplify in public comments. And I understand where the trade unions are coming from in their concern and opposition to this plan, because it is their livelihood. And we have to recognize that right out front and make sure that we have a plan to protect them, and that, we are ensuring that there are strong labor standards in these industries, clean energy industries. So I'm going to just, we'll start with the building sector recommendations. So the building sector, as I had mentioned, is, the largest source of emissions. It is also, the toughest nut to crack, because we have over 6.2 million buildings in New York that need to, most of which still need to be electrified and made more efficient. One set of recommendations in the scoping plan focuses on building codes and standards, including passing the Advanced Building Codes and Appliance Standards Act, which is actually will hopefully be passed in this legislative session. This is the scoping plan actually, even though it's not going to be finalized this year, the draft plan actually calls for passage of that legislation this year. Another key recommendation of the scoping plan is all electric requirements for construction of new buildings beginning in 2024 for most residential buildings, and then extended to new construction of all building types by 2027. This is technically feasible, it's cost effective, and new construction is really the low-hanging fruit. And again, this is another recommendation, because of the process of getting changes to building codes through the Code Council. This initiative would have to be passed in legislation this year in order to go into effect in 2024. We only have days left of this legislative session, but these are really critical measures to get passed. For existing buildings, the scoping plan recommends that by 2030, zero emission standards should be in place for end-of-life replacement of fossil fuel heating and hot water equipment, with a 2035 date for start date for large multifamily and commercial properties. Also by 2035, zero emission standards for new appliances like dryers and stoves would also be put in place. And just to be clear, these standards wouldn't require you to replace a working system. This is for new equipment purchases only at end of useful life. So as we transition to electric technologies, we have to be transitioning off utility gas, which is what most New Yorkers currently use. This is a complex undertaking because it's tied into a wider utility-owned gas system. So the shift has to be carefully coordinated, and it cannot increase the burden on low and moderate income households. The scoping plan recommends that a couple of things happen as soon as possible. Critically, the laws that govern utility gas and electric service, it's public service law, have to be made, and actually also transportation corporations law, have to be made consistent with the Climate Act, eliminating utilities' obligation to serve gas and supporting the transition to an equitable, energy efficient electrification pathway in buildings. I mean, right now, public service law requires that anyone who wants gas has to be hooked up with gas. NYSERDA and the utilities also have to immediately stop promoting gas and must ramp up marketing and incentives for heat pumps. I was very pleased to see actually in this past state budget a $5,000 geothermal tax credit was included. These are the kinds of actions that need to be taken to make it affordable for people up front. And finally, importantly, the planning has to be done to transition to clean heating, cooling systems in a way that maintains affordable, safe, and reliable utility service. There was a bill introduced by Senator Krueger in this session called the Gas Transition and Energy Affordability Act. It would provide the kind of comprehensive planning approach that's needed, and it would be really great to advocate for its inclusion in the scoping plan. No false solutions. In public comments, it's important to express support for the scoping plan's focus on efficient electrification to eliminate emissions and to steer clear of false solutions being promoted by the fossil fuel industry and utilities like renewable natural gas and hydrogen for buildings. And finally and critically, the scoping plan must include a firm commitment to the $1 billion annually that's needed to support disadvantaged communities, low and moderate income households, in transitioning to efficient electrified homes. This is what NYSERDA has estimated is minimally necessary in annual spending. Okay, moving on to transportation, and that's the kind of car I have in the upper right, Chevy Bolt, great car. So, as I mentioned, it's a close second to buildings in terms of its share of greenhouse gas emissions at 28%. A big part of the solution here again is to electrify, though it's not all of the solution. We also have to expand public transportation as an option for folks, especially outside of cities, and make our communities more walkable and bikeable. Thanks to a bill that was signed into law in December of last year of 2021, all sales of new cars in New York will be zero emissions beginning in 2035. We have a gap though, because as I mentioned earlier, the analysis of the scoping plan estimates that we need to increase EVs on the road to about 3 million by 2030, and EVs are more expensive than gas-powered cars. So the only way to make this happen is through policies that affect pricing. In scoping plan comments, I think it's valuable to express support for the recommendation for a progressively structured fee base. This would be an additional fee on the purchase of fossil fuels to pay for incentives for EVs. It would also help to eliminate the sales tax on EVs, and of course, it's not just about the cars, it's also about accelerating the build out of a fast charger network across the state, which is also a recommendation of the scoping plan, and fixing utility rates to encourage EV adoption and off-peak charging. Let's see. So we also have to expand public transportation. This, in my opinion, did not get enough focus in the scoping plan, and I think it would be very valuable for the public to share comments about the needs, the public transportation needs and priorities in your own community. There's a whole set of recommendations around the development that supports non-motorized transportation at the community level as well. And by the way, New Yorkers for Clean Power is having a teach-in on May 24th from noon to 1 that does more of a deep dive into the transportation section recommendations. If you're at all interested, we can give you information about registering for that event. Okay, on to electricity. So we've been talking about the need to electrify buildings and transportation, but to be truly zero emissions, we need a power grid that is powered by clean, renewable energy. We need to get to 100%, and we're currently at about 27%. And this is mostly legacy hydro. Only a very small percentage is wind and solar. And in fact, our use of fossil gas has actually increased since 2019 with the closure of Indian Point. So we have a lot of work to do. Um, the good news is that we already have a clean energy standard in place. The Public Service Commission has revised that standard to meet our 2030 renewable target under the Climate Act, which is 70% renewable energy by 2030. This standard requires utilities and energy supply companies to procure increasing amounts of renewable energy over time until we reach those statutory targets. But a big hurdle, these projects actually have to get built. And there are a number of scoping plan recommendations focused on ensuring that we're actually building out enough renewables for utilities to procure. We'll also need to greatly expand storage capacity, both to meet short duration needs, like when everyone is using power at home after work and school at the same time, as well as long duration storage needs or some resource that can be called upon during like a bitter cold week in winter when we're all using, heat pumps at full tilt and the sun isn't shining as much and the wind may not be blowing as much. So to meet our emissions goals, the scoping plan really needs to come down firmly on the side of prohibiting the permitting of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is something to emphasize in public comments. It's also important to support the plan's call for DEC regulations to ensure a continual decline in emissions from power plants until we reach zero emissions in 2040. As recommended by the Climate Justice Working Group, the first plants that should close should be those disproportionately harming disadvantaged communities. There also have to be protections in place for all communities affected by plant closure, including support for workforce transition, funding for localities to offset lost property tax revenue, and an enforceable requirement that the plant owner is responsible for site remediation. It's important to support the scoping plan recommendation to set annual megawatt targets for state permitting of renewables so that enough projects are getting built to supply our needs and enable us to start, ramping down our dependence on fossil generation. The same goes for battery storage. The scoping plan recommends expanding the clean energy standard to include a storage or else creating a separate storage standard. Either one of those would be, would help make sure that we're getting the storage capacity, that we need over time. Other important recommendations focus on supporting high-value renewable projects that contribute to equity, resilience, and smart land use, like expanding agrovoltaics. There's a huge potential for that in New York. That's the co-location of renewables and agricultural practices, whether it's grazing, which is actually there's already sheep grazing co-located with solar panels, but that we've, again, hardly scratched the surface and haven't done any, there are no examples yet in New York of crops being grown, as far as I know, on the same site as solar. The utilities also have to be required to better support renewables on the local grid, including expanding hosting capacity so we can interconnect more local renewables to the grid, and speeding up review of interconnection applications. There are there is a lot that needs to be done to better support local communities as partners in the clean energy transition, including mapping tools and resources for streamlining permitting and zoning at the local level. Benefits should also be expanded to communities that host large-scale projects. Nationally, we're seeing public sentiment is really becoming less and less supportive of renewable siting. And we're also seeing that in our state. And, if we're going to make this shift, we really don't have a choice. So I think strengthening those partnerships with communities is going to be critical, and enabling communities to proactively identify sites for solar in their communities should be a part of the solution. So a point that really does not get enough attention, or an area that does not get enough attention in the scoping plan, is public education. We need a massive public education and information campaign, both because we can't reach our goals without public support, but also because we need to inspire young people to pursue clean energy careers to make this transition happen. I earlier cited huge numbers about job creation, but we need the trained and people that want to pursue these careers and fill these jobs. The scoping plan should direct NYSERDA to support a well-funded statewide campaign. And really, this has to start now, because as I mentioned earlier, the fossil fuel industry is kind of, there's a void right now. Very few people really know what we're doing in New York on the climate front, and opponents of the law are filling that gap with their own framing of the issues. We also need climate education curricula in our K-12 schools. And again, as I said, begin encouraging kids from an early age to pursue clean energy careers. Work also has to be done, as I mentioned, to recruit, train, and skill up the necessary workforce. Again, unless New York begins to develop this workforce now, trained workers will not exist to fill the jobs that we need. Okay, we're on our last section for this Sunday afternoon. Waste. I don't have that much time to get into detail on these recommendations, but waste accounts for 12% of emissions. I want to point out that that's only end-use emissions and does not take into account the huge life cycle emissions of products and packaging. We actually did a great teach-in, New Yorkers for Clean Power, on the waste section recommendations with Judith Enck. Organization Beyond Plastics has done some incredible research on the climate impacts of the plastics industry, and they've shown that the U.S. plastics industry is on track. Emissions from that industry is on track to surpass emissions from coal in this country by 2030. So to start with organic waste, again, we don't have time to do a deep dive into this, but we have to, as I mentioned at the outset, divert our organic waste from landfills and from incineration. Incineration has a whole host of other environmental problems, as well as contributing to carbon emissions. But look, edible food waste can be used to help feed the 1.5 million food insecure people we have in New York. And inedible organic waste can be composted and used to improve soil health, which is great for the climate because, it improves the ability of soil to sequester carbon, and it's great for agricultural productivity. So we've got to figure out in a very comprehensive way how, ways to divert this waste. And there are a number of good recommendations in this plan overall, but they need filling out. But one big one is to require a per ton surcharge on all waste. to basically discourage the landfilling of waste and also help fund recycling and reuse programs, compost programs, and the like. Other recommendations include expanding local financial assistance for organics recycling infrastructure, incredibly important, and requiring local solid waste management planning to incorporate food scraps recovery for instance, local food pantries. And there are recommendations to expand organics collection model organics collection programs, and with an emphasis on multifamily and public housing in particular, and develop a plan to support markets for compost and encourage use by farms as an alternative to synthetic fertilizers. The scoping plan makes a number of recommendations around waste reduction, which is critical, obviously, including enacting extended producer responsibility programs, by request only legislation to reduce single-use plastics, and requiring minimum levels of recycled content in products, among other measures. There's a long laundry list, but these are all like very straightforward pieces of. It's largely legislation that would have to be passed, but that would make a huge impact on the reduction of single-use waste and single-use plastics in particular in New York. Okay, so I know that was probably felt like a lot of information, but I can take a few questions afterward, but I have to emphasize that, submitting public comments is key. This draft plan, there was they did, invite the public to, provide input at different stages of the development of this plan, but they really need to hear from communities, and they need to hear the perspective. We're not it's not one size fits all in New York, and our communities have different needs and priorities. We've put together the public comment period is open for written comment through until June 10th. The Climate Action Council has held, I think it was 10 in-person hearings, 9 or 10 in-person hearings and 2 virtual hearings. So those are now done. But really the written comments, people only had 2 minutes to give comments at written hearings, at the in-person hearings. So you couldn't really get into any substance in those venues anyway. The written comments are where you can really, get into the plan. And I can share these slides with you. We have put together, there's an online portal where you can submit comments, but you can also email them in if you feel too restricted by the 2,000 character limit of the Climate Action Council. New Yorkers for Clean Power has put together a toolkit. I'm realizing now that it's at the top here. The link at the top is this toolkit basically walks you through the public comment process, and we have public comment guides in specific sectors, including buildings, electricity, and waste. Transportation is still in process, but 3 of the 4 sectors are done, and I encourage you to peruse those. But essentially, key messages we want to get across are that, all electric solutions to replace fossil fuels in buildings and transportation powered by a clean, renewable grid is the most efficient and realistic pathway to achieving our zero emissions goals, not the false solutions being promoted by industry. And we need to commit as a state to a level of investment that is going to ensure that disadvantaged communities are assisted in this transition. I think that overall those are very key messages. And I am going to stop sharing my screen. See if there are any questions.